Module 4. The Qualities of Effective Assessment Systems. The last module looked at the steps that developers can take to embed continuous improvement within their assessment procedures. This module examines in more detail the qualities of a good system of assessment. The characteristics that users look for when choosing assessments, or that educators look for when evaluating an assessment system. In other words, the characteristics that make the assessment useful. 4 qualities of useful assessments. First, practicality, reliability, validity, financial consequences. The 4 elements represented in Figure 4.1 represent a broad but by no means universal consensus on the essential qualities that make up useful language assessment systems. I would not wish to downplay the importance of other qualities that have been proposed, such as authenticity, Bachman and Palmer 1996, or absence of bias, Kuhnen 2004, which are discussed in Module 7, but I would argue that they are reasonable when accounted for within this 4 quality framework, presenting the 4 qualities in Figure 4.1 in the form of a cone with practicality at the base and beneficial consequences at the top is intended to convey something about the relationship between them. Practicality is found at the base because it is a necessary condition for all assessment. Unpractical assessment when simple not survive for very long, whatever its other distinctions. Beneficial consequences that might flow from use of a language assessment are the apex of the cone because they are the ultimate objective of any assessment system. This hope for consequences may include teaching and learning becoming more effective, opportunities opening up for language learners, and employers finding suitably qualified staff to carry out linguistically demanding tasks. Their position in Figure 4.1 reflects that they are supported by the other qualities beneficial. Consequences are not guaranteed by the presence of the order 3 qualities, but are very unlikely to follow if an assessment system lacks practicality, reliability, and validity. Movement up the cone also represents increasing controversy. Judging the practicality of an assessment system is a relatively straightforward matter. Its validity and consequences will be much more open to despair. Practicality. Practicality was described by Bachman and Palmer 2010, page 262, as the difference between the resources that will be required in the development and use of an assessment and the resources that will be unable for these activities. It is self-evident that an assessment that lacks resources will not be sustainable if there is not enough time, equipment, money, or expertise to operate an assessment. It may never be used and certainly will not survive in use for very long. In reality, assessment is always in competition for resources. In any language teaching organization, informal assessment in the classroom has to compete for time and attention with other day-to-day activities, while at the more formal, summative, and the continuum, assessment has to complete for funding will libraries, computers, software, teacher salaries, and all the other essential requirements of a functioning school, college, or national education system. Where quality assessment is made a priority, resources can often be found to support it. Practicality can be thought about in terms of efficiency, the extent to which the commitment of resources to a system of assessment is justified by the benefits it brings. As in other areas of expenditure, assessment choices involve a complex balancing of benefits and costs, as where 1993, page 22, put it, we have to be sure that the tasks we are using are the most efficient way of obtaining the information we need. Equally, it is important to ensure that all of the activities involved in an assessment, including development, scoring, giving feedback, reporting results, and monitoring quality, are taken into account and that they are carried out as efficiently as possible. Educational managers need to weigh up the gains from investing in assessment against the other demands on their budgets. Teachers need to think about how much of the limited time they have with their students should be spent on assessment, and how best to integrate and balance this with other activities. Assessment system cannot and should not continue to be used unless a compelling case can be made that the benefits of maintaining them outweigh the costs. It is not easy to find the right balance. Teachers may enthusiastically take up new ideas, only to find that they cannot keep up with additional workload. Or they may resist new forms of assessment because they worry that the new system might involve extra tasks that they cannot fit into their already busy schedules. Often managers underestimate the amount of time and the commitment of resources required to support good quality system and so fail to invest enough. Alternatively, they may overestimate the cost, conclude that they are prohibitive, and fail to invest at all. Many assessment projects fail because planning only allows for the cost of development and not be substantial additional resources needed to keep the system going. It can be difficult to persuade managers and policymakers that is not enough just to be seen to have a test or assessment in place. That it is vital that it should also be useful as a basis for making informed decisions about assesses. Making it useful will mean allowing for the ongoing costs involved in maintaining, supporting, and improving it. As with other areas of policy, Good quality assessment often relies on energetic individuals who are prepared to argue for funding, demonstrate the value of good practice, criticize bad practice, and recognize what is and is not achievable in their working context. Table 4.1 suggests a list of illustrative practical issues that may constrain an assessment development and therefore need to be taken into account. Batchman and Palmer 2010, Brown 2005, and Bach 2009. These are organized in relation to the roles identified in Module 2. Judgments about how best to allocate resources usually bring with them disagreements and political controversies, in addition to what the calls resource constraints of the kind presented. In Table 4.1 back 2009 observes that they are often additional system constraints imposed by established working practices and cultural issues. In some places, performance is traditionally reported in terms of percentage, while in others, teachers tend to use letter grades, certain approaches to assessment, and certain item formats are favored in some countries, but rejected in others. Multiple choice question and standardized examination are well established in Turkey, for example, but are seen as controversial in the Russia's Federation, where assessment by teachers using performance assessment is the tradition. It will generally be less continuous to go along with local expectation than a try to take a different direction. Advances in computer technology have made some techniques, such as controlling and timing the delivery of assessments, more practical. They have opened up opportunities to capture more kinds of data, such as how long each assessment takes to respond to each item. However, different software platforms also impose their own limitations. It will not be possible to deliver ideas for innovative task formats if the software lacks the functionality, and some techniques are actually easier to manage on paper. Problems with software or with the logistics of delivering material to large numbers of assessments by computer have put an unexpected end to many otherwise promising projects. While it is not possible for any assessment to be reliable, valid, or beneficial if it is not sufficiently practical to get off the ground, it is quite possible to have a practical assessment, one that is administratively manageable, that has very little to recommend it in terms of other qualities. In fact, such assessments are too common. As Baker 1989, page 4, rather cynically express it in relation to end of year examinations. All that is necessary is that the exam too difficult or traumatic and have some purgue relationship to the course the learners have followed. Very often in situations where assessments are used, no information is ever collected that would allow users to tell whether they have any of the qualities that might make them useful. It seems to be enough that students answer questions and that grades or scores are awarded, even if nobody can explain what this might actually mean. Reliability: we use various tools every day to measure aspects of the world around, as clocks to measure time, scales for weight, thermometers for temperature, and so on. When we use them, we want you now that we can interpret these tools consistently. If the time on your watch was sometimes the same as the clocks on the wall and sometimes very different, or if your scales told you that 1 liter of water weighed 500 grams in the morning and 2 kilograms in the afternoon, you would really reasonably conclude that they were faulty and would not trust what they told you. Of course, many of the tools we do use every day are not very accurate, but they are good enough for our purposes. We generally get to meetings on time. We measure out ingredients and cook food at the suitable temperature. Much more precise tools are available, but there's this trade-off between precision and cost. Accuracy is expensive. Most people don't mind arriving a little early or late for a meeting and barely notice if the temperature in the room is 1 or 3 degrees warmer or cooler than is displayed on the thermometer. Measurements of time, temperature, or weight involve tangible quantities that most people do find controversial. Language ability is a much more slippery and less certain concept. It most approaches to language assessment. It is assumed that language abilities represent a kind of mental trait or attribute similar to physical traits such as height or weight. We often describe people as having more or less language ability in rather the same way as we describe them as being tall or short. Anyone comparing fluent speakers with learners just beginning to grapple with the language may not little difficulty in accepting this idea. On the other hand, all language learners know that they are better at coping with some situations than others. Those who have studied a language as an academic subject to a high quality level often struggle to communicate when they first travel to a country where that language is spoken. Those who learn a language in the country becoming fluent through interactions with friends and neighbors may have more difficulty with formal written language. In these circumstances, it is more difficult to judge who has the greater language ability. For this reason, it may make more sense to conceive of many different kinds of language ability, depending on the social purpose for which the language will be used. The development of assessment of languages for business or for medical or academic or other specific purposes reflects this point of view. In any case, it has to be acknowledged that we are simply not in a position to measure language abilities with the same precision that we can achieve for weight or temperature. Even the very best language assessments cannot come close to the consistency and accuracy of watches or scales. It is inevitable that this estimation of language abilities will involve substantial uncertainty or measurement error. The best we can do is to estimate the impact of this upon the scores we obtain that there are established statistical tools that allow us to do just that. Regrettably, users of assessment results often fail to understand the implications of a measurement's error. They often overlook or ignore it. If students A has scored 60 points on a language rest and students B has scored 52, users many assume that this is concrete evidence that students A has greater ability than student B. As this section will illustrate, however, this is not necessarily a reasonable assumption at all. There are several potential sources of measurement error and each affects the degree of confidence we can place in the accuracy of results affects the degree confidence we can place in the accuracy of results. These sources of error include measurement using different tools, measurement of different occasions, measurement of different groups of assessors, and measurement by different individuals. If they have reasonable estimates of the amount of error and understand how to interpret this information, users can gain a sense of how accurate scores and grades might be as indications of the assessor's abilities. Without this information, they can only guess. Measurement using different tools consistency. Just as some tape measures or scales are more accurate than others, there can be little doubt that language assessment can also be more or less accurate. Also, unlike tape measures, assessments are usually more accurate along a certain limited stretch of the range of ability than at points above or below this. It is unthought a tape measurement could count distance between 4 and 60 centimeters. Quite precisely, 56.3 centimeter, 48.1 centimeter, but could only provide fuzzy estimates of about 25 centimeter or 30 centimeter or at least 80 centimeter for distances outside this range. A complicating factor is that we have no dependable yardstick to help us judge just how accurate our language assessments are. If our watches show different times, we can check them against a word clock on the internet. If other weighting scales disagree, we can use a standard way to check which is accurate. Sadly, there is no generally accepted gold as standards measure of language ability. When they measure exactly the same qualities, we can translate results between different measurement scales by applying a simple calculation. Kilograms to pounds in weight, Fahrenheit to Celsius in temperature. In contrast to weight or temperature, the concept of language ability itself is understood in rather different ways by individual teachers or test developers. According to their beliefs and intentions, teachers may use different assessment methods in different combinations to measure abilities and arrive at grades. Translating from one perspective to another may not always be possible, and this causes obvious difficulties for the users of assessment resources. Content sample. Even where two assessments are intended to measure the same knowledge, skills and abilities are built to exactly the same specifications and are administered to the same people at the same time. In other words, where two forms of the same assessment are combined, there will be differences in the results. This is because each program can only deal with a very limited selection of the language to be assessed, and it is a matter of change how selection of the language to be assessed. And it is a matter of change how far the sample that is chosen matches each learner's limited knowledge. To illustrate, sampling issues, let's say a teacher gives Class a group of 20 students, an informal rest or quiz based on 1,000 words they are supposed to have learned. To check whether the students know the words, leaving aside the tricky question of what it actually means to know a word. He could give them a quiz made up of 1,000 questions. 1 point is available for each correct response. If all the students perform to the best of their ability and manage to stay awake, this quiz would show the teacher exactly which of the words each student knows, but it would also take too much time and mindful of the need for practicality and efficiency. He might decide that a quick 10-item quiz based a random selection of the word should be enough to tell him which students now know most of the words and which to do. In fact, although the teachers doesn't know this, each student has learned a random selection of exactly half of the word. In this scenario, taking the quiz is rather like asking each student in the class for flip a coin 10 times, as each student effectively has a 50% chance of knowing each of the words on the quiz. As all the students know 50% of the words, you might expect most of them to get 5 questions right out of the 10. But if you fill your coin 10 times, it's not particularly likely that you get 5 heads, only about 25%. Or 1 in 4 people get this result. Most people, 66% or 2/3, will find they get 4, 5, or 6 heads. So for most of Class A, the scores of 4, 5, or 6 do roughly reflect that they know about half of the words. According to the laws of probability, however, there is a good chance that one of two students might score 7 points and one or two might score 3 points. There is also a good chance that at least one could be very lucky or very unlucky. In the sample of words on the quiz, there is about a 4% chance, just less than 1 in 20, that a student who knows just 50 of the 1,000 words will actually score. 8 out of 10 and similar chance that one would score 2 out of 10. It would not be astonishing if one scored 10 or 0. Now let's imagine the teacher gives the same quiz to second group of 20 students, class B, but in this group each student only knows 250 of the words. Based on probability, each student in this class has roughly a 25% chance of success on each question, so we should expect just over half, 53% or 11 of the students to score either 2 or 3. On the other hand, we could expect 4 or 5 students to get a score of at least 4 out of 10, and 3 is a fair chance that one student might be able to score 6 or more. If the teacher decides to recognize his classes on the basis of this quiz, placing those scoring 3 or below into a lower level and those scoring 4 or above into a higher level class, we would expect to see around 7 of the 40 students going into the wrong class, even if we increase the distance in the probability of success. In the different groups, let's say that in class A+, students all know 750 words. 3 are still likely to be learners. In class B, who will perform at least as well on the quiz as the lowest scorer in class A+, simplify because of the choice of words on the quiz. Happily for the teacher, there are ways to improve reliability. One is to increase the number of questions, of course. 1,000 questioners would make the picture very clear. But even 1,000 questions would be enough to maximize the possibility that members of Class A might be confused with members of Class B. It is unlikely but not impossible that anybody in Class A would score less or that anybody in Class B would score more than 35 out of 100. On the other hand, taking a representative sample of the full range of language abilities is usually a much more complex propositions than the one facing this teacher. Every effort is made to maximize quality precision in very difficult, time-consuming, and costly to achieve. Measurement of different occasions, stability. A problem when trying to measure people's physical characteristics, like height, weight, and foot size, is that this can fluctuate significantly. By late evening, people may be as much as 2 centimeters shorter than when they wake up in the morning. Mental abilities also functionally being affected by the time of day and physical conditions. performance on tasks of all kinds is affected by alertness, health, and mood. This means that even if we were able to administer identical and perfectly accurate language assessment on different occasions without learners recalling the answers they gave the first time around, we would still see differences in the learners' scores on each occasion. And it's not only people abilities that change over time. If we don't very carefully control the conditions on each occasions that we administer an assessment, the experience may be very inconsistent and comfortable. Heat and traffic noise might make the afternoon's listen test session more difficult than the mornings when it was cool and quiet. If the teacher of Class K allows her students 10 minutes longer to complete their writing assessments, assignments that than was allowed for students in Class J, they may produce better work even though they have the same level of ability in writing. Holding condition constant can help to make results more reliable, but it can also be very limiting. Using only strictly controlled tasks for assessment in class can rule out the use of more creative, unpredictable task types and restrict the role of the teachers to that of an invigilator, prevented from taking formative opportunities to investigate students' difficulties or to help them learn from and improve on their performance. In reality, when tests are used by teachers, there will inevitably be a good deal or variability in conditions. Balancing the negative effects on readability from this variation over the course of a few weeks or months, teachers generally have numerous changes to observe what students can do. This means that they gather far more evidence of students' abilities than would be available from most tests. It has been argued that this broad sample of unassessed abilities may offset the limited reliability of the individual assessment tests made by teachers Black and William 2006. Measurements of different individuals. Test taker characteristics. Differences in performance over time are closely related to the person attributes of assessors. What Bachman and Palmer 2010 called assessing characteristics, these were divided by O'Sullivan and Green 2011 into three categories: physical, psychological, and experiential. Physical or psychological characteristics include, along with short-term illness and injuries, longer-term disabilities that might impact upon test performance, such as poor eyesight causing difficulties in reading the test materials, and stable biological characteristics such as gender. Psychological characteristics also include relatively short-term issues such as concentration and mood, together with more stable characteristics such as personality type. These characteristics can play a major part in performance on assessments. For example, some individuals suffer from such debilitating as anxiety when taking tests that they may be unable to participate, while others seem to respond very positively to test conditions. Every effort should be made to put assessors at their easy so that they are all able to perform to be the best of their ability. In Table 4.2, the experiential characteristics include language, background. Speakers of different languages encounter different kinds of difficulty when learning target language, and educational experiences such as experience of learning languages or previous practice with a certain type of assessment. General knowledge is also likely to contribute to performance. Knowing something about the topic of a recording might help an assessor to perform well on a listening test. Learners with little experience of using a language for communication will struggle to respond to a self-assessment questionnaire based on real-world language. Use, for example, assessors will find it much easier to respond yes or no to a statement on the self-assessment questionnaire, such as, I can make a complaint about simple matters, for example. The light is room doesn't work. Association of Language Testers in Europe 2002. If they have experience of similar situation, contrasting groups of assessors. Example, men and women, adults and children may have different amounts and different kinds of knowledge about the world. Differences between assessors affect estimates of the reliability of measurement. When assessments are administered to more homogeneous groups, they produce more reliable results. When different populations of assessments are involved with different areas of strength or weakness, it is not so straightforward to rank them, and results tend to be less consistent in an assessment that includes the use of articles in English, a and the. For example, if the rest takers are speakers of French or Spanish, languages that have articles systems, the results are likely to be more consistent than if the French and Spanish test takers are joined by speakers of Turkish and Russian, speakers of languages that do not have article system. Generally, low-scoring French assessors may perform rather well on the questions involving articles, while otherwise high-scoring Turkish assessors might perform relatively poorly on the same questions. Some differences in performance associated with test taker characteristics may actually be relevant to the decisions that test users wish to make. For example, a Japanese learner of Chinese is likely to have an advantage over a Thai learner in a reading test because the Japanese writing system is based on Chinese characters, but the Thai is not. However, this advantage also applies in the real world. Japanese people can read and understand many signs written in Chinese without speaking the language. The test simply reflects this natural advantage. Other characteristics may affect performance on an assessment but not affect performance in the real world. This will distort the picture given of real-world abilities. It has sometimes been found, for example, that teenage boys tend to perform a little better when grades are based on one of tests that use multiple choice questions, while girls perform better when grades are based on regular work exercises. Murphy, 1982. A multiple-choice test may tend to advantage boys, but real-life language use does not usually involve choosing answer A, B, or C, and so the purpose of the assessment. Limiting the range of formats used for assessment to multiple choice questions may therefore introduce a small but systematic bias in favor of boys as a group, but the advantage will not necessarily apply to every individual. Measurement by different individuals, scorer, and rater reliability. Just as individual assessors perform inconsistently, so individual scores may award different numbers of points to the same performance. All scoring processes involve a degree of interpretation, uncertainty, and inaccuracy. See Module 3. However, the form of score reliability that attracts the most attention is rater reliability, when scoring involves the judgment of extended constructed responses. If 10 teachers of raters as scores and extended performance responses are known, are all asked to judge the same performance, it is extremely unlikely that they will all award in the same score. When the intent of reliability, even when the same person judges the same piece of work on two different occasions, the scores awarded can change sustainably. The extent of this variation is a matter of intra-rater reliability. Perhaps the earliest statistical study on the inconsistencies among raters was carried out by the British statistician Edgeworth, 1890. He published a short composition written in Latin and invited qualified examiners to score it on a scale of 1 to 100 as though it had been written for the prestigious Indian Civil Service examination. He received 28 responses. The number of scores awarded at different levels is shown in Figure 4.2. The examiners thought the composition worthy of the full 100 marks, but one scored it as low as 45 and three others also gave it a failing score of less than 70. Edgeworth, 1890, page 653, concluded that I find the element of chance in these public examinations to be such that only a fraction, from a third to two-thirds of the successful candidates, can be regarded as quite safe, above the danger of coming out unsuccessful if a different set of equally competent judges and happen to be appointed. You might like to try a similar experiment to discover whether the situation has improved since 1890. Task 4.5. Happily, it has possible to retain raters to be more consistent. This is usually done through standardization. Session in a typical standardization session for an interview test. A group of aspiring raters is shown several videos recordings exemplifying different scores levels and covering the full range of the rating scale. The raters look at previously rater interviews, discuss the rating scales, the criteria with the develops, and try to adjust their own interpretations of the scale until they feel they can consistently match the predetermined official scores. The trainers are then asked to work independently to rate more scoring recorded of interviews, then asked to work independently to rate more scorings of interviews. Their ratings are compared with the official scores of these interviews. If the new raters consistently agree with the official scores, they are allowed to work as raters on the assessment. If they do not achieve consistent agreement, they are either given further training until they become consistent or they are rejected. When scoring operational tests of writing or speaking, it is generally recommended that at least 2 judges should rate each performance independently without seeing each other's scores. And their scores should be averaged if the two scores differ by more than one band or the rating scale. A third independent rater should be used. The two closest scores of the three should be treated as the final score. Loma 2004, Regal 2002. Even where extensive training is given over time, idiosyncrasies in rating behavior tend to recur. Lumley 2005. Retraining should be carried out before each round of scoring, and constant monitoring is needed to check that raters remain in line with the intended standard. One way to monitor raters would be include some previously rated scripts for which official scores have been fixed and to check that the raters match the official scores or most or all of these. The same training procedures can be used regularly to encourage teachers to grade learners against comparable standards in their classroom assessments. Of course, teachers who fail to achieve consistency cannot usually be excluded in the same way as test raters, but they can be given ongoing training. Just as double rating should be used in large-scale testing, grading decisions should be moderated by other teachers. To ensure fairness, examples of written work or recordings of performances should be given to other teachers to rate independent against the shared criteria. Where disagreements occur, further rating should be carried out. If a teacher is consistently harsher or more lenient in their grading decisions, then his or her college's grade should be adjusted accordingly before they are announced to the assessors. There are statistical techniques such as multifaceted range analysis that can be used to make this kind of adjustment. See Batchman 2004. 7 ways to build reliability into assessment design. The following suggestions are based on Hughes 2003, Brown 2005, and Douglas 2010. Make the task clear and unambiguous. If the assessment is well laid out and clearly explained so that assessors can all see exactly what they need to do, there is a better chance that their performance will actually the intended language abilities. If instructions are not clear to everyone, that is not a problem with the assessors, but with the assessment which needs to be improved. Add more tasks or more assessments. If you ask one question, a weak assess may get lucky and give a correct answer. If you ask more questions, luck will be less of a factor and a consistent picture of assess abilities is more likely to emerge. The more often you observe a student during a course, the more likely it is that you will get a reasonable sense of where his or her strengths and weaknesses lie. Limited the scope of what you assess. A grammar test with only one format will be more reliable than a test involving a range of language skills and abilities. With multiple formats, however, this will also limit what can be learned about the assessor's abilities. Standardize the condition. Results will be more consistent if the conditions are the same for everyone, although there may be good arguments in favor of offering choices to assessors or giving some assessors more time than others. Such variation in conditions will reduce reliability. Control how the assessment is scored, providing clear and comprehensive answer keys. Unambiguous rating scales and training for scores or raters are all likely to lead to more consistent results. Add more scores, raters of performance. If two people score an assessment and the item scores are compared, errors can easily be identified and dealt with. If two scorers or raters scores a performance, their disagreements can be settled through a third opinion. The outcome is much more likely to be a fair reflection of the assessor's abilities. Assess learners with a wide range of ability. It is much easier to tell the difference between a carving made by an expert master craftsman and one made by a beginner than to choose between two pieces made by experts in the same way. It is relatively easy to build an assessment that reliably distinguishes between very high and very low ability. Language users, if all the assessors are at roughly the same level, estimates of reliability are likely to be lower. Validity. It is important for all kinds of language assessment to be reliable. A learner is told by one teacher that she had clear native. Like pronunciation would feel confused and miss if her next teacher commented that her strong accent made her speech almost unintelligible and recommended remedial training. An employer who recruited two trainers with identical scores on an interview test would lose confidence in the test if one trained arriving for work seemed to be fluent in the language and the other incapable of connected speech. However, consistency of result is not a guarantee of their quality. Experience tells us that it is possible to be consistently wrong. Defining validity. Validity is often seen as the essential quality of good assessment. According to the classic definition cited in language testing handbooks such as Davis 1990, Hughes 2003, and Brown 2005. A test can be considered valid when it really measures what it purports. The measures Pascual 1922, page 196. Pascual 1922, page 1996 went on to explain the ensuring the validity of a test involved securing cross-respondence between test results and practical life. Test results are more comparable to life results the more nearly the test process approaches the character of the life process. If the steps that the assess has to go through to obtain a high score on the test closely match the processes that language users go through when carrying out tasks in real life, the assessment accurately represents relevant figures out tasks in real life. The assessment accurately represents relevant figures of the assessed knowledge, skills, or abilities, and so must be valid. The connection between tests and real-life abilities identified by Pascual remains central in modern ideas about validity, but his definition is now seen to be too limited and somewhat misleading. A more current and comprehensive definition is given in 1999 Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretations of test scores entailed by proposed uses of tests. American Educational Research Associated et al. 1999. This definition is not as straightforward but important. It recognizes that there can be no such thing as a valid assessment. Validity is not properly thought of as a quality of assessments at all, but is a quality of the interpretation that users make of assessment results. An assessment can only be considered valid for a certain purpose. The value of an assessment that is intended to inform one kind of decision and adequately measures what is purports to measure for the purpose may be fatally undermined if results are interpersonal, interpreted to support a different kind of decision. A further problem with Pascual 1992 classic definition of validity is that it implies a binary yes or no kind distinction. Results are either valid or invalid. But validity is better seen as a matter of degree. Inference may be more valid for one kind of decision or for one population of assesses than for another. It follows that when evidence shows that the results of an assessment are sufficiently valid to support a decision about one assessed on one occasion. We cannot simply assume that they will be equally valid to support similar decisions taken about different assesses or decisions taken on other occasions. The process of collecting evidence of the validity of inferences based on assessment results is known as validation. Many different approaches can be taken of validation, but the approach adopted should shed light on the conclusions that we wish to take about learners when using the assessment, ensuring that evidence and theory will support the interpretations of test scores entailed by proposed uses of tests must begin at the design phase. When designing an assessment, we have seen that the first step should be to define and agree on what knowledge, skills, or abilities are to be assessed in order to inform decisions about the assesses. The point has already been made that knowledge, skills, and abilities cannot be directly observed and measured in the same way as physical characteristics such as height or weight. However, it is generally assumed that they can be described either as attributes of the individual human mind or a products of human societies, and that they are variable. Some people have more of these attributes and others have less. For the purposes of assessment, abstract conceptions of this kind are known as psychological constructs. If we make claims such as your grandmother is the best cook in the neighborhood, we are implying that she possesses more of some underlying capacity or trait of cooking ability than the rest of us. But what exactly do we mean by cooking ability? Than the rest of us. Is my understanding of the concept the same as yours? How could I prove the truth of the claim that your grandmother is the best cook is the same ability needed to prepare good Chinese food as is required to prepare good Brazilian food or good Russian food. Do savory dishes require the same abilities as sweet dishes? By the same token, different uses of language may involve different forms of language ability. Bachman and Palmer, 2010, page 43, suggests that designers need to define language ability in a way that is appropriate for each particular assessment situation. Depending on the purpose for our assessment, there are many language-related constructs we might be interested in measuring. This could range from a very broad overall language proficiency or reading comprehension to reading for gist, reading for detail, or something as specific as the ability of language learning to ask and answer questions about personal details such as where he or she lives, people he or she knows, and things he or she has. Council of Europe 2001, page 24. Different kinds of validity. If evidence can be used to provide to shed light of the value of assessment results, The following section provides a brief introduction to this. Two different kinds of criterion-related validity can be distinguished. One involves comparing results on the assessment being validated with other indicators of the assessor's current state of ability. Test scores might be validated through comparison with teacher grades. Grades from one teacher might be compared with grades awarded by others. This is known as concurrent validity. Predictive validity, on the other hand, involves the comparison of assessment results with how well the assessors perform on a criterion measure sometime after the assessment has been given. This shows how useful the assessment is as a forecasting device, telling users how assessors might get along in their future roles. Examples include validation of a proficiency test through comparing results with judgments of job performance. After applicants have been accepted, the academic performance of students studying a subject in a foreign language. See, for example, Cho and Bridgman, 2012, and validation of a placement test by comparing scores with teacher evaluation of their students. Have spent some time in their classes. Anderson et al., 1995. Both concurrent and predictive validity have some serious limitations. There are practical difficulties of classroom teachers, in particular, in gaining access to suitable criterion measures. Concurrent validations is dependently on the quality of the criterion measure. Scores on different assessors may be very similar, suggesting that both are measuring the same thing. But this is no guarantee that they are both measuring the right thing. New assessments are often intended to measure rather different knowledge, skills, or abilities than the old assessment, so very close matches are not really desirable. If the level of agreement is low, it is unclear whether it is the new assessment of the criterion measure that better captures the learner's abilities. With predictive validation, the trouble is that people scoring below a certain level do not often get admitted to the course or accepted for the job to which the assessment relates. Although people achieving passing grades may perform well, there is no evidence about those who failed. Perhaps they would have performed just as well or better given the chance. Once accepted for a course or job, people may perform poorly for reasons unconnected to their language abilities, health, finances, family problems, and so on. It is often just not possible to track the performance of learners after they have left high school. These difficulties mean that relationships between assessment results and later performance are usually found to be very weak. Construct validity. It is a fundamental requirement for the effective operation of any assessment system that everybody involved in interpreting assessment results shares at least a basic understanding of the construct or constructs involved. It could be the sound trust if a test developers build a test intended to establish whether or not a learner has the language skills necessary to hold a conversation about everyday topics such as entertainment and travel. But an employer interprets the results to mean that the learner is ready to work in a field where knowledge of specialist language is essential. As a nurse, for example, participating in surgical operations, or as an air traffic controller with responsibility for the safety of passengers. Content validity. If we are going to use the results from an assessment, we should be satisfied that performance on the assessment will really require targeted knowledge, skill or abilities, and that the balance made between components in the assessment will provide a sound basis for the specific decisions that will be made about the assesses. Ideally, the material included in an assessment should represent the full range of knowledge, skills, or abilities that the assessment is intended to cover. Unfortunately, life is not usually that simple. It really isn't possible for any assessment to cover the full range of content that is might be desirable to assess. Limitations on the time available and on the methods that it is visible to use to administer and score the assessment mean there will always be construct other representation. These limitations suggest that developers can generally only include a very small fraction of the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities that they are interested in. Perhaps the best they can hope for, a huge 2003 page 54, suggested is to sample widely and predictable to assess as wide a range of content as possible and to do this in an predictable way so that learners and teachers cannot force what is likely to be assessed and then concentrate or learning only that relatively narrow area of content. Regrettably, sampling wildly and unpredictably may have a negative effect on reliability, as assessors taking different forms of the assessment will be presented with different content. Developing assessments also always involve balancing considerations and making difficult choices, bearing in mind the practical limits on how much material can or should be assessed. Tasks should be carefully chosen to ensure that a sufficient range is included. Identifications and how far this has been achieved serve as evidence for content validity. The key sources of content validity evidence are reviews of assessment material. Content validation can and should be carried out before an assessment is put into operation through evaluation of the design statement and specifications. Experts in the knowledge, skills, or abilities being assessed may be consulted on the content of assessment. They evaluate how adequately they believe the items assess the intended knowledge, skills, or abilities, and how comprehensively they cover this once the assessment becomes operational. Routine checks need to be made to ensure that the forms of the assessment have adequate content validity, thus the materials assess the intended constructs and reflect the specifications. Another form of validity often mentioned in language assessment handbooks is face validity. This is very similar to content validity, but the judgments are made by non-express. Assesses parents, employers. The distinction between the two therefore rests on the potential controversial issue of who should be recognized as an expert judge. Members of the stakeholder groups listened about are not recognized by measurement, specialists as experts with well-informed insights into linguistic theory. This means that face validity is not regarded as a genuine source of validity evidence. In practice, the reaction of stakeholders certainly do have to be taken into account if only as system contains back 2009 that restrict the designer's freedom of choice. If learners, employers, and others do not believe that as an assessment is credible, that it provides useful information, they may fail to take it seriously or reject it altogether. See Alderson et al. 1995, page 172 to 173. Criterion-related validity. While evidence about the content of an assessment can be collected before it is ever used, other kinds of validity evidence only become available once results have been obtained from assessments. When test developers first began to talk about validity in the early years of the 20th century, they were usually referring to the relationship between the results of their assessment and some alternative indicator of the same learner's knowledge, skills, or abilities, such as teacher judgments or results from another assessment of recognized validity. A criterion measure, this is what would now be termed criterion-related validity. As assessment is said to have criterion-related validity if the results from the assessment and from the criterion measure correspond to each other. If assessments are ranked from the highest scoring to the lowest scoring, the order will be the same on the assessment and on the criterion measure. Evidence for the validity of the content of an assessment and for its relationship to criterion measures can both help to inform an overall judgment about how well an assessed performance truly reflects their knowledge, skills, or abilities, and whether the information provided by the assessment is relevant and adequate to support the intended decision. Ultimately, this is evidence that the theory underpinning the assessment, the contrasts, provide a sound basis for the decisions. Construct validity is therefore seen as embracing all forms of validity evidence. One well-established approach to collecting construct validation evidence is the multi-trait, multi-method approach. Campbell and Fix, 1959. The validator sets out to discover whether results from the assessment under investigation, assessment X, are similar to results on another assessment, assessment Y, are similar to results on another assessment, results on another assessment that uses different task types but address the same knowledge, skills, or abilities. This is a variation on concurrent validity, sometimes called convergent validity. At the same time, results on other assessments that use the same task types as assessment X but assess different knowledge, skills, or abilities should rank the assesses in a different order. Divergent validity, an application of the multi-trait, multi-method approach in language test validation, is Bachman et al. 1995. Comparison between the Cambridge First Certification in English (FCE) and the Test of English as a Foreign Language. Over recent years, complementing statistical approaches such as multi-trait, multi-method, there has been increasing interest in other ways to explore whether the knowledge, skills, or abilities that are involved when assessed structural assessment tasks are the best. The knowledge, skills, or abilities intended by the developers. This has been called cognitive validity. Baxter and Glasser, 1998. Where 2005a. One approach to cognitive validation is to ask the assessors about how they carry out tasks. This is often done using verbal protocol methods that involve assessors reporting on how they found a correct answer or how they decided on the content and structure of an essay. See, for example, Ware et al. 2012. It is also possible to observe how assessors perform by analyzing their behavior. Insights have been gained into how readers respond to comprehension questions by recording their eye movements and tracking where they direct their attention while they read. Paulson and Henry 2002. Or by recording each keystroke when they compose the responses to assessment tasks on a computer. Chan 2012. Interpretative arguments assessing the evidence. McNamara 2000 explains that the process of validation is now often like to a trial in a law court. In trials in many countries, lawyers for each side in the case present a version of events, and the judge or jury members make a decision about which seems more plausible. Similarly, the users of assessment results or those holding them to account need to weigh up the evidence and judge whether an assessment provides a sustainable basis for their decisions. Unlike in a court of law, however, the case is never considered closed. More arguments can also be made and new evidence so there is always scope to improve the quality of the assessment. The process of weighing evidence can be convinced as a series of Watkin et al. 1999, called inferential bridge. Linked in a chain of argument connecting test performance with practical life and so satisfying or judge challenging the use of the assessment as a means of gathering evidence to support a decision. The steps of bridge in the interpretative assessment use argument, Bachman and Palmer 2010, are set out in Figure 4.3 and Table 4.3 as a series of claims that a test users would want to be able to make about an assess on the basis of performance on the assessment. Range against these claims are credible alternative explanations for the results or potential rebuttals of the claims. Test users and validators need to explore different explanation for an assess's performance, including both those explanations that supporting the intended interpretation and those that do not. Assessments as maps. As tools for communicating about the world around us, assessments have been compared to maps. Henning, 1987. Like maps, different approaches and formats for assessment are sustained to different purposes and must be carefully chosen. A map that is very helpful for one purpose may be quite useless for anyone. And an expensive detailed map is not always the one that best suits our needs. Practical maps often have to be quite limited in size. Designers must be selective in choosing which figures to display so that the paper or screen will not be overcrowded and unreadable. Clear presentation of one set of figures such as roads may involve taking away other figures such as hills and forests. Walking maps provides a lot of detail, but can cover only a small area. This may make it easier to follow a walking route, but more difficult to locate places of interest. Useful transport maps showing bus or train routes tell us the names of the stops, but do not accurately represent the physical distances between them and give no information about the landscape. When we likely to give us the information and level of detail we need, and more like map makers working with a small screen display assessment. Designers only have a limited opportunities to build up a picture of an assessor's abilities. They need to determine which figures of language ability it will be most useful for the user to know about when making decisions. In assessing achievement, the focus will be on what has been taught. In assessing proficiency, it will be on the figures that are essential in the real-world situations, where the assessors will be expected to use the language. When users come to choose a language assessment, they should be clear about the kind of picture of learner abilities they need in order to make reasonable decisions. Maps must be regularly updated and improved to take account of changes in the landscape, new technologies, and the changing needs of travelers. Similarly, we must constant review and revise assessments to ensure that they continue to give us the right information. The work of validation never ends. Beneficial consequences. Although maps might appear simply to be neutral descriptions of territory, they are much more than that. They can be powerful tools for control and exploitation. Some of the earliest known maps were used to plan military campaigns, fix land ownership, and decide how much tax citizens should pay. Lines and pictures drawn on maps can become new roads, cities, boundaries, and barriers, with dramatic transformative effects on the landscape and on people's lives. It has long been recognized that language assessments can also have powerful effects or impacts upon the knowledge, skills, and abilities they are intended to describe or measure on an individuals, especially assesses, and on society more generally. Assessments can be life-changing. They are used in deciding who should have access to important opportunities in areas such as immigration, further education, and employment. They are served as relatively straightforward gateways to new prospects for some people and stand as impenetrable walls keeping others included. Assessments promise a fairer way of making decisions than the systems of patronage and nepotism that they replace, but their apparent neutrality can mask continuing injustice. The content format and administration of assessments can work systematically in favor of one group of assessors and against another. The people who administer assessments and make decisions based on assessment results generally have an official status that gives them power over the assessors, and it may not be easy to hold them to account. If an assessment is unfair or has been poorly administered, Shohami 2001 and truly useful assessment is one that has more benefits than drawbacks for everyone involved. Washback. One area of impact that is of particular concern to teachers is known as washback. Washback connects the design and use of an assessment with what teachers and learners do in the classroom when prepare for the assessment. It is often claimed that high-stakes tests in particular have a detrimental effects on learning, as teachers focus their efforts on the content of the test at the expense of skills that are not tested. Figure 4.4 sets out how washback is believed to come about. First, the way learners respond to an assessment has a good deal to do with the design of the assessment and the content that it covers. In preparing for an assessment, teachers and learners would naturally be expected to focus on the knowledge, skills, or abilities that they believe the assessment deals with and give less attention to those that do not seem to be included. In a well-designed instructional program, consideration is given to the relationship between what learners are intended to learn. That focal construct in 4.4 and the content of the assessment. The overlap shown in figure 4.4 is closely linked to face validity, see above, as it reflects the point of view of the teachers and learners preparing for the test, their perception of what is being assessed. This influences the washback directions, which may be seen as positive or negative if an assessment validly measures the range of abilities that learners need to acquire. Teachers should be encouraged to reach towards that assessment because learning for the assessment will also mean learning for life beyond the test. The direction of washback will be positive. If the assessment appears to cover only a limited amount of content, construct underrepresentational, or if it assesses abilities that are not included on the planned curriculum. Construct irrelevance. Teachers may stop teaching important aspects of that curriculum in order to concentrate on the features that they believe are assessed. The direction of washback will be negative. Historically, arguments about washback have been most instances when there have been disagreements about the nature of language ability and effective language teaching. Groups arguing for a radical new approach come into conflict with assessments that are based on the established old approach. A new curriculum introduced a focus on speaking skills, for example, but the old test is still used and it does not include a component assessing speaking. Teachers feel under pressure from students and their parents to get good results on the test and so focus on the skills that are tested, rather than on the speaking skills mandated in the new curriculum. The solution, it has been argued, would be to bring in a new test that does include a speaking component. This would encourage teachers to teach according to the new approach. More recently, research has highlighted a serious flaw in this line of argument. Teacher and learner behavior are not as easy to manipulate as it suggests. First, people may not be fully aware of the changes made to the test or of its implications for teaching and learning. Second, they may not be sympathetic to the changes and may resist them. A traditional teacher may not believe that it is possible or desirable to teach speaking skills and may not avoid making any changes to her practices. Her college may want to teach speaking but lack confidence in their own speaking abilities or lack the training to manage speaking activities in the classroom. The research into washback suggests that teachers tend to pay close attention to the format of a test rather than considering the underlying construct, the knowledge, skills, or abilities targeted by the assessment. Just focusing on practice with the test format might not really help test takers to improve in the abilities being assessed. Green 2007. A new spoken interview assessment based on personal informational intended to assess impromptu conversational skills might in practice encourage memorization of formulaic exchange or short memorized speech on obscure topics, even though this may be of rather limited value outside or even inside the examination room. Shohami et al. 1996. Not every learner has the same access to preparation, resources, textbooks, sample papers, computers, and tutors. Individuals have their own ideas about what might be affected, ways of learning, and of achieving a success. They may or may not be persuaded by advice from testing organizations, teachers, textbook writers, and others. Washback will be more powerful where all of the stakeholders in the educational system share the same beliefs about effective test preparation and work together to achieve it. In practice, washback tends to be highly variable. Washback variability in figure 4.4. Within a single class, one learner may radically change her language learning behaviors to prepare for a test, while another makes no change at all to his. The variability in the way that people respond to an assessment is linked to their perception of the importance and the level of challenge that the assessment represents. These factors influence the washback intensity that each individual experiences. Washback will not be intense. Learners are not likely to change the way in which they learn in order to prepare for the assessment. If doing well doesn't not really matter to them, this could be because they think success is likely to be embarrassingly easy. Or on the other hand, because they think they stand no chance of getting a good score. Washback is likely to be more intense if learners do value success and think that achieving it is challenging but realistic. In these circumstances, learners are likely to do whatever they can to prepare for the assessment. They might increase the amount of studying that they do, or they might be prepared to change their study methods. To limit the intensity of the washback from any single assessment so that no one assessment comes to dominate teaching and learning, it may be wise for test users to base decision on as wide a range of evidence as possible and make it very clear to the test takers that this is their policy. The strategy for improving validity advocated by Hughes 2003, page 54. Upsampling widely and unpredictably is also relevant to washback, as it means that learners and teachers cannot foresee what is likely to be assessed and so concentrate their efforts on learning only the relatively narrow area of content. All assessments have consequences for at least one person. The impact is unlikely to be really beneficial unless the assessment is practical, reliable, and valid. if the information gained from an assessment is misleading, it is likely that many of the consequences flowing from it will be damaging. That is not to say that beneficial consequences will automatically come from good assessments. Potential benefits will only be fully realized if all participants in the educational system work together. Feedback. While watchback from tests can have a powerful effect on the behavior of teachers and learners, the consequences of formative classroom-based procedures are more immediate and potentially more far-reaching. Such assessment must, of course, have practicality, reliability, and validity. The scorers and users, usually the teachers and learners themselves, need a clear and accurate pictures of what it is that learners are or are not able to do. This will not be possible unless the tasks and questioning techniques they use are of good quality. However, understanding something about a learner's knowledge, skills, or abilities, correctly inferring what they can or cannot do is not enough. To be useful, the insights obtained through formative assessment procedures must inform effective action. The main priority of formative assessment is therefore the provision of feedback that encourages and promotes learning. Stobart 2006. Feedback is a metaphor based on systems engineering. It involves using information about the current state of a system to regulate and make adjustments to that system. The unsighted technology of water clocks, see figure 4.5, employs the concepts. Water passes through a gap of a fixed size at a constant rate, and this fact can be used to tell the time. If water drips through a hole in the bottom of one bowl into a second bowl, the amount of water collected there shows how much time has passed. However, if the level of water in the tap bowl goes up or down, the drips will flow at different speeds and the clock will become inaccurate. For the clock to work well, the water in the tap bowl must be kept at a constant level. One way to solve the problem would be to employ a person to watch the system and add water when needed, but that would be very inefficient. Instead, our ancestors worked out an ingenious alternative. They put a float into the tap bowl. If the tap bowl is filled this with water, the float rises and blocks the inlet pipe as the water level flows because of the dripping water. The float sinks down and the inlet pipe is unblocked, letting water through to fill the bowl. In this way, the water level is held constant. The system regulates itself because information about the current state of the system is used. Feedback to change the state of the system, to open or close the inlet pipe as necessary. In a similar way, accurate information about current performance in the classroom obtained through assessment can be feedback to the teacher and learners. If learning is found to be proceeding smoothly, the class carried on as planned. If the assessment reveals that all is not going well, carefully chosen feedback can be used to be trigger motivation that will keep learning moving forward efficiently. Repeating, practicing, or revising if necessary, exploring and extending where opportunities arise. Less time is wasted because learners are not left to struggle with material they do not understand and are not held up by studying material that is already known. If no information is obtained or if the information is of poor quality, feedback cannot be effective. The information that teachers look for and the amount and kinds of feedback they can offer to their students to help them improve their performance will depend in large measure on their beliefs about language learning, what they accept as evidence that learning has occurred, and what they believe are the steps required to help students to make progress. Leong 2010, The Validity of a Formative Assessment approach is therefore closely tied to the theories of learning that support it. William 2011 provided compelling evidence for the power of well-conceived feedback given to learners of all ages to improve learning generally and to narrow the performance gap between their higher achievement and low achievement learners. However, he also contended that simply providing feedback gives no guarantee that beneficial consequences will follow, and observe that some forms of feedback have actually been found to be counterproductive. The failure of much of the feedback given by teachers to foster better learning may have a variety of causes. Wiggins 1998 suggested the students can often find the feedback they are given uninformative. It leaves them feeling that they know that they are close to or far from the goal, but they don't know that what or where the goal is. Wiggins 1998, page 47. It does not convey to the learners what a better performance would look like or what they need to change in their current performance to improve it. On the other hand, when potentially useful feedback is provided, it is often ignored by learners because it is provided at the wrong time. After the work has been completed, it has been observed that as soon as grades are awarded, many learners tend to ignore the teacher's comments and so fail to benefit from the feedback they provide. Table 4.4 lays out some of the figures that have been found to characterize more or less effective feedback strategies. Effective feedback is given at a point when it can be used by learners. This means that learners should be given opportunities to improve their performance on the basis of the feedback. Feedback is more likely to promote learning if the learners are challenged to think about ways in which their work has been successful. In communicating their intended message and ways in which it has been successful, they should then be able to use the insights gained through feedback to try again or to revise what they have produced. This is one reason why advocates of assessment for learning suggest that the awards of grades which signal that a piece of work is finished should be delayed for as long as possible and be open to modification through remedial work. Another reason is that instead of encouraging greater effort consistently, low grades can cause students to feel that they are poor learners and lose motivation, while consistently high grades can encourage complacency and also lead to a reduction of efforts. William 2011. What Hill and McNamara 2012 term person reference feedback, praise, or criticism of learners is not considered particularly valuable because it is uninformative about how performance should be modified to make it better. It is much more helpful to other task reference feedback that is concerned with the qualities of the learner's work. Brevity is favored. One or two well-chosen observations will be more likely to bring about productive reflection than a lengthy essay or lecture from the teacher on everything that could be improved. Feedback is more effective and the overall system of assessment more coherent if it can be demonstrated to relate to learning goals. In other words, it should be explanatory or corrective, making it as clear as possible to the learner how his or her work satisfies or fails to satisfy the criteria for competent performance and how it could be improved. Hill and McNamara 2012 feedback based on checklists or rating scales, provided that learners understand this, and therefore more useful than simple grades or scores. Models of successful performance can also help learners to notice what is successful and unsuccessful about their own, although it should be made clear that models are not intended for direct imitation. Instead, learners will be better placed to benefit from feedback if they can learn how to interpret the criteria and use them to assess the work of other learners, and eventually to assess their own work. Teachers as well as learners can benefit from receiving feedback. If a class is struggling to understand a new concept, the teacher needs to know this so that he or she can provide more scaffolding support that helps the learner to understand how to complete a task or find another way to convey the ideas. When learners are already familiar with whatever is being taught, the teacher may be able to move quickly through the unit or bring in some more challenging material if such issues are only picked up during an end of unit test. It may be too late to take action Frequent informal assessment activities keep teachers in touch with how well learners are able to assimilate new information and help to highlight where any difficulties lie. Summary: the right tool for the job. As tools, language assessments are closer in nature to maps than to tape measures, although they may differ in their precision and in the units they employ. All tape measures are designed to measure length. In construct, maps represent and highlight different aspects of the multi-dimensional world according to the needs of the user. Like maps, language assessment do not and should not all measure and represent the same thing. The choice of assessment technique should reflect the kind of decision that users wish to make and the kind of consequences that they hope will follow. The fourth quality framework of practicality: reliability, validity, and beneficial consequences informs design and helps users to apply the price principles, taking full amount of the intended purpose of assessment. Just as there is no perfect map, no assessment can fully satisfy all four essential qualities. Ultimately, users may be satisfied that an assessment is a justifiable use of resources because it is a better basis for decisions and leads to better consequences than the alternatives. At the same time, everyone involved should strive to improve on current practice.